Lovely to see you all, and I'm sure that you will let me know if there are any issues with the slides as we go along. Here we go. So what's with the accent? And I'm very grateful for those of you who are translating, and good luck to you, really. And those of you who are listening to me speaking, it can be quite a challenge. I come from Australia, and I'm from Brisbane, which, if you haven't been, it's a lovely place, and I encourage you to come because there will be a wonderful congress there next year. If you can come, that'll be terrific. Be lovely to see you. That was the University of Queensland where I work there too. But why I do research is that I have a daughter with Down syndrome, and there she was then, very cute. She's now 27, tells me every day that I'm here in Scotland, that she's not missing me at all. So when they grow up, they're not as cute, I've found, but she was certainly the reason I got into research, particularly around education, because I was a teacher to start with. And I have 3 children altogether, and I think it's important for us to remember that inclusion is about everybody being all together in the classrooms. And we think about, in this webinar, students with Down syndrome, but what applies to them applies to all. So hello to you too. It's terrific that you're here, and I'm very pleased to be here, and I look forward to further conversations. What I would like to talk about on our time together today, a brief look at inclusive education. It sometimes has different people think about it in different ways, but there is an agreed international position, and I would like to start with that to make sure that what I'm talking about is what you think I'm talking about. I'll talk about the role of Down Syndrome International in this. I'm the Vice President, and I'm also the lead of the education task group that put together the guidelines with a lot of work from many, many people around the world. So we'll have a bit of a look through those and then think about how they might be used. Inclusion can be seen as a philosophy. So it's a way of thinking about education, about the world, and about our place in it. It can also be thought of as a process, something that we do, and it's also a practice. You may well have seen this diagram. It's become quite a famous diagram, and the source is, whoops, I don't know whether you lost the screen, but I did. Sorry if you did. There we are. This diagram is taken from that excellent literature review by Tom Hare and others, published by the Alana Foundation. But the definitions are from the United Nations Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, General Comment number 4. And it's a lot of text. The pictures are good though. Let's have a look at exclusion. Exclusion occurs when students are directly or indirectly prevented from or denied access to education in any form. This happens around the world, and I'm sad to say in my own state of Queensland. So students are either not allowed to enrol to start with, or they are excluded. Sorry. Sorry, beg your pardon. Back to you. So the diagram shows that these kids are not getting education at all, and around the world that's happening to a lot of kids with intellectual disability. Segregation is where they're getting an education, but it's not with their age peers. It's not in their classroom they would attend if they didn't have a disability. And we know that from research, that's not the best place for them. It's not to say they don't learn in those settings, because kids will learn wherever they're taught. But what we do know is that when they learn alongside their age peers, they learn better. Now, integration is where they are in the room perhaps, but they're just not included. And so they're not engaging in the same way. So they're there so long as they can make all the adjustments. They're the ones who have to fit in. It's not about the environment, the classroom being welcoming for them. And that too does happen a lot in my state of Queensland. But inclusion is something quite different. We see from the diagram, the dots are now in the midst of all of the other dots here. And if we look at that definition, and I'll give you a moment and I will read it through, it involves a process of systemic reform, embodying changes and modifications in content, teaching methods, approaches, structures, and strategies in education to overcome barriers with a vision serving to provide all students of the relevant age range with an equitable and participatory learning experience and environment that best corresponds to their requirements and preferences. It's lots of words in there, but taking time to think about it, there's a word that's missing. And a word that's missing is disability. And why I think that's such a wonderful thing is that it reminds us that inclusion is actually not about people who might have disabilities coming into this space. So it's not a new word for special education. It's not like that at all. It's actually about thinking about all the learners in that place and what can we do to support them. Now, I've laboured on that for a little bit because it's actually, in my view, a really important thing to make sure that we aren't thinking about something else like special education, but a new term. Inclusion is actually the welcoming, valuing, and supporting the diverse learning needs of all students in that general education environment. And if you belong, you will be missed. We will miss that a student isn't there. I think those are lovely things. And for me, it's a fabulous personal philosophy to think about how we can support all the learners in our classrooms when we're teaching. So inclusive education is not a synonym for special education, and yet we still see around the world that that's the case. In some countries, there's a view that we've just changed the word. And in some places, they will have special education teacher crossed out and now turned into an inclusive education teacher, but they still teach in a separate building or in a different classroom, or they teach just students with disabilities. That's not inclusive education. And it's not to say that special education isn't important. Of course it is. It's just different. And so special education might well be the sort of work that I might do to help too many phones. So it's the sort of thing like I might do in special education, that Down syndrome has special, I do research about how to support learners with Down syndrome. So that is looking at a particular group of students, but I also work in inclusive education to see how they can be best supported in the general classroom. So it's not just about people with disabilities. That's important too. It can be people who speak the language of a classroom as a second or other language. It could be about people with all sorts of different backgrounds, maybe different socioeconomic backgrounds. It's about all learners, gifted, multilingual, sporty, linguistically diverse, all socioeconomic levels and so on. So it's about everyone from the community learning together. Now, inclusive education, because it is part of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of People with Disability, was a very important principle for Down Syndrome International when we put together our guidelines. In the literature, and this is summarised and it underpins the guidelines, we know that learners learn best in inclusive classrooms. We know that other learners in the class benefit too, and that's a really important point that was covered in research early on, because it's all very well to feel good about including students with intellectual disability, But we also do want to make sure that other learners don't suffer from that. And that was an early concern. But research was very quickly able to show that other learners benefit and can actually do better when they have other students there in the classroom that perhaps were never there before. And probably the main reason is that if a teacher is focusing in on how to support individual learners, they're focusing around removing barriers, and that can benefit all of the students in the class. Then if you know that certain students are doing better because teachers are able to think about removing their barriers to learning, it's hardly a surprise then that effective inclusive schools have improved outcomes. So we see this in whole school measures of school achievement. But inclusion, as we've noted, it's more than just being in the room. So it doesn't stop at just enrolling kids. They've got to be able to engage with the same topics. And then we have things like we have situations where the mates in the class help other kids to, it just becomes part of social inclusion. So reflect. I'd like you to think about what it means for you. You might like to think about adding to the chat. You might like to write some notes. You could draw, post on social media, perhaps. All those different options, because like we do in Universal Design for Learning, we give people different options. So I just want you to take a minute now just to think about those words and do they mean something for you? And I'll give you just a minute to think of that. Well, that was a short minute, but let's stop in 3, 2, 1. We've looked at inclusive education just so that we're all on the same page, thinking about the same thing, the way we're talking about it. So in our guidelines, we focused on inclusive education and supporting members. We've got plans for the future and an invitation. So why we did this is that the evidence is clear. That's a really important thing. We know that the evidence is clear. And we also know that it's the right approach for learners with Down syndrome. So in the guidelines at the beginning, we put a whole lot of these initial things that we felt was important to state, to bring up to the front, things about what we believe about inclusive education and what inclusive schooling is about. Then we go into the actual recommendations or the guidelines. And you'll see that these definitions are there as we've talked about just now. Why we do it is also because it's our role at Down Syndrome International to support our members. We support them to implement best practice and to comply with their UNCRPD implementation. Because we have no authority or jurisdiction, nor would we want anything to direct people, but we're there to support and to provide evidence and ways forward so that every one of us in Down syndrome associations around the world are not doing these things by themselves. So how we did it, I'll just go through that in now. And the guidelines are available for free download, and if they're available in English, French, and Bosnian, and some other languages are coming as well. And if you're interested in translating them, the crew at DSI have toolkits to support translation into other languages. So the guidelines have three parts. So leading is actually really critical. The role of the school leader, it doesn't have to be just the principal, but it is everybody in a school, but often it does fall to the leadership team to build an inclusive culture and lead staff. In teaching, there's guidelines around teacher education. That's pretty important because I work in that context of teaching the next generation of teachers. And I was talking with a group today and comparing to when I did my teacher education, we didn't have anything in our pre-service teaching about inclusive practice. It just was not considered. And you could have done some units, but that was as a separate area for those who were going to teach in special schools. It's very different now. But how we actually prepare teachers is part of research. And so we summarise that research in the guidelines. We talked about how teachers might plan and how they might then teach in an inclusive classroom. We also recognise that learners are critical in this. And so we talked about learning in context prior to school, at school, and post-school, because we know that our learners with Down syndrome don't stop learning. They learn throughout their life, again, so long as they have the opportunity to be taught. Oops. So the guidelines were created to improve this learning internationally. And we also wanted to promote lifelong learning opportunities because we know that for many learners with Down syndrome, once the school years are finished, their opportunities for formal education often come to the end. And sadly, because that's often when they're just getting into the groove of learning. We also wanted to be aligned with Article 24 of the UN CRPD and the Sustainable Development Goals, which is again about inclusive education, important international documents. What we did was we established experts in the field to co-author the guidelines. The writing team met to establish a process, and we recognised early on that our guidelines could be completely ignored if we didn't acknowledge that we had practice and policy and research that we could connect into. We invited international stakeholders to provide feedback, and many of you were involved in that process. And then the results of all of this, it's in the background section. We presented the draft guidelines to a senior representative of UNICEF on World Down Syndrome Day back at the UN in 2019. It was a big moment. We're very excited that that got to that point. And that meant that we were then out for the world to comment and give us their ideas. So we had lots of organisations that came through. We got 35 different organisations providing an incredibly detailed amount of feedback and advice. And we were really very grateful for that, because for these to be truly international and truly useful, we have to incorporate the ideas and views. Some of these were actually really challenging to take into account, because for some, it was a recognition that some countries are further along the process of inclusive education than others, and that some still regard the building of special schools as a goal when they have enough money. So countries where there might have been some challenging getting enough education provided for all the children in their country, they would say things, well, when we can, we will afford, we'll build special education as special schools and so on, which is difficult to reconcile. And we think in getting this feedback from around the world, we were able to bring together what we believe are useful guidelines for all countries to head them towards inclusive education. So lots of feedback we got lots of good things, and it's nice when you've put together things to get some good feedback. Some of this, you'll see this one up here, this will be hard work to implement. So it's not to minimize the challenge that faces people in implementing inclusive education worldwide. If it was simple, we would have done it years ago, but it's also not impossible. And we're all working to do it better because it makes a big difference to our learners with Down syndrome. So once it was incorporated, put into the final version, we published them in 2020. And as I pointed out earlier, they're available for free download from the DSI website. So let's just have a look at what the guidelines look like in the different parts. So at the beginning, there's key considerations. We wanted to have them stand alone in case there were people who were not as informed as we are about Down syndrome and its impact on learning. And so we put in some fairly minimal amounts of background information, knowing that people can go and read further if they need. And so one of the important aspects was that learners are more than the chromosomes. So while, yes, it is a genetic condition and we are well aware of that, there are many other factors that influence how well learners learn. And we can see the evidence of that from the institutional era, when babies in many countries were put in institutions where they lived their lives, and often their lives were quite short. They had very limited education, if any, and many did not talk, very few would read, and the sorts of educational outcomes that are not seen today. We see so much richer results in education. So we know that, but we felt it was important to put that in as key considerations. There are 3 human rights concepts that are in the UNCRPD that we felt were relevant. Inclusive education, so that's why I sort of went through a bit of that at the beginning, just to make sure we were all on the same page. Lifelong learning, as I mentioned, this is a really critical aspect, and perhaps we're becoming more and more aware of how important it is as more of our people with Down syndrome reach middle and older age and continue to want to learn, and they need the opportunities. And equal opportunity to do that is one of the fundamental things in the human rights concepts in the UNCRPD. And we also talked about learner characteristics for learners with Down syndrome. So if teachers or schools picking this document up, they can have a quick look about what perhaps are characteristics of learners with Down syndrome and what are the impacts perhaps of the condition on their learning, without trying to say that they're so different, they need to be treated in a different way. It's more about just understanding what sort of barriers there might be to learning so that teachers can plan ways around them. Now, don't worry, your eyes don't need to get strained here. Here we're talking about guidelines for leading. So that's the whole lot of them. You can read them in your own time. But I thought 19 is not picked out, and the guidelines are special. I've just chosen it today as an example. So 19 says, leaders should establish a shared vision of inclusion across all levels of the educational system, working in partnerships with families and the broader community. So when you look at the guidelines, it's got all of a description of the research that underpins it, and then these are the recommendations. So that's one of them. Just looking at that one, the shared vision became something that we saw was a really important aspect in the research around what leaders do that makes a difference. So when you've got an inclusive school that's really going well, one of the key features is that all of the people in that community have that shared view about what they're heading for. And the leaders in the school are typically the ones who've brought that vision together. Now, in teaching, there are another group of guidelines. Let's have a look at one. Students with Down syndrome should be given the opportunity to learn the curriculum specified for their school year level, adjusted as necessary to enable their engagement with the learning outcomes. So if we look at that one, this one is in a way sometimes different to what has been standard practice in teaching, and it was certainly different to the way I was told to do things. I was taught that you assess learners and you go back and you teach them from where they are. We don't do that anymore, because kids with Down syndrome, if you take them back, and if they go back many years, they will never catch up. And so they get further and further and further behind. But the research is saying something different, a different approach. And that if they're given the opportunity to learn the curriculum for the year level they would be in if they didn't have a disability, remarkable things can happen. And so you need adjustments, adjusted as necessary to remove barriers, but these students really can do quite remarkable things. So the research background led to that guideline. In learning, there's a whole lot of recommendations here, guidelines here, because there's a lot of evidence and a lot of research happening in this space. So there were a lot of points to make, and we pick out this one today. Secondary school should be devoted to the teaching of secondary school academic curriculum, because opportunities to learn that material become limited once the school years have passed. So let me talk a little bit about that one. There are a lot of parents who were involved in studies that were talking about students after they'd finished secondary school. So formal education had finished. And the parents were saying just that it's what a shame they didn't spend more time at secondary school learning the academic curriculum, because that opportunity doesn't happen anymore. What had been taught to them were things like life skills and functional education goals, things like catching buses or making their lunch or hygiene, those sorts of things, which are undeniably important. However, they're the sort of things that families or carers or people in the environment can teach a person at any point. What they don't have the opportunity to do, though, is learn the academic work that often underpins engagement with the continuing social connection into the world. Things like knowing what the culture in the environment is, knowing how to use a calculator, knowing how to, knowing what in English Shakespeare is, but it's also in other places as well. So knowing the parts of the curriculum that underpin further study and further thinking is actually a really important thing. So that came out in the research. So thinking about we've gone to the education, the introduction of the guidelines. Now let's think about using the guidelines. Well, DSI have gone on to produce toolkits and have webinars, so there are recordings available. And the toolkits help the generation of translations and the implementation. We don't undertake the translations ourselves. We don't have that expertise, but we also work with people who do. And there are a lot of people around the world who are experts at translation. We have to, the toolkit gives advice about how to get the translation recognised as an official translation, because as you'd be probably much more familiar than I am, it's really important to make sure that the translation is true to the original document. And so if you were interested in doing that, we would love to do that, because making these accessible around the world is really important. The UK Down syndrome Association got a grant to do a pilot study of inclusive education, and they just wrapping that now. And so that's been a very successful project, looking at what are some of the barriers. So when people know what they want to do in implementing inclusive education for students with Down syndrome, but things get in the way, what are they? How do teachers get around them? How do schools get around them? What can be done to support others? So more information about that's emerging, and that's on our website. There are future plans. So we want to understand the process of long-term systemic change. I'm an optimist, and I see so many improvements from when I was at school, when there were no students with Down syndrome in classes at all, right to now where it's commonplace. So I don't think we should feel badly. I think we should be recognising what we're doing very well, but we also need to acknowledge that we've got a long way to go, that there's still problems that school systems are dealing with. So what we want to do is understand that process and how we can help support our members in different countries to increase the process of inclusive education. We also want to continue to build recommendations about how people might go forward and continue to use the guidelines. And we certainly have more language versions coming, and we would like more. So free download is part of the invitation, but we also encourage you to engage with DSI members around the world to share implementation experiences. We all learn from each other. Things that we might be finding challenging, somebody else might have a solution, and vice versa. So I just share some advice from a teacher and a group of teachers. So my colleague Barbara Clark is there, and these are 3 teachers. One is a teacher aide. So in Australia, we have teacher assistants, so they're adults without teacher qualifications, but they're there to assist the teacher.
You highlighted when you were talking before about her wanting to do what the others were doing, but also you were quite pleased with that. Do you want to tell me a little bit more about how that's evolved? Has that been your policy from the beginning of the year, or has it evolved over the year?
To be honest, no, not really. It hasn't been until we sort of started attending these PDs. Yes. We sort of thought, because at the start of the year, the child was doing her own work, and
because that's what she'd come from, and it was also a new thing for Lauren and I. Neither of us had worked with a Down syndrome child, so for me it was a total new learning. So I would really go to the aide who had worked with our child previously. So I thought there was a lot more information there for me to gain through conversations, and Lauren as well. So we started that way, but then we just picked up.
We just started. Probably the biggest thing, we just started doing it. We just started saying, all right, let's do it. This is what Pentagon's are doing, who are the group achieving below the standard. Let's put our child in that group and see how she goes, and it's worked. And really, like we said, now
she does it any other way probably. And we hope, we were saying that this is what will move and you know, and continue next year. That it doesn't change to her doing her own thing or being hovered over and things done for her, because she can do a lot of things on her own.
She is more independent now.
Yes. Do you think that's contributed, that doing the same things, or is it just developmentally?
No, I think it's contributed as because she'd rather spend time with her peers and actually work with her peers and having
all these individual
beside her or someone beside her all the time.
A lot more engaged.
And which is actually, she's developed a lot more friendships out of this as well, within the classroom and outside, and it's actually gained her confidence, I think, as well, that she can even attempt to do what the other children are doing.
Because even through that video, you just notice how she just sitting next to Robbie and she's just complying with everything that he's showing her. Not feeling intimidated by the whole role.
So I love that message of just do it. So with the guidelines, it provides some advice and some ideas to help people just to get in and get going. But really, it comes down to just doing it. If we wait until we're perfectly prepared and everything, we feel like everything's all sorted, it'll never happen. And it's a process. So that's where we want to go with it. And I'm going to just skip through a few things. I'm just going to skip through that story. Whoops. Because I want to give time for us to chat and to talk and answer questions. And we probably need more time for that. So in preparation for that, I'm sure that you're familiar with these sort of things where you can put your questions in the chat and we can look at those. But in preparation, just think about what you would think are the main ideas. What were the big pictures that we were talking about, the big points that were important for you. And I'll give you a minute to do that. Okay. For me, the big ideas are inclusive education leads to benefits for all learners. I think that's absolutely fundamental, that this isn't something special that we do as an extra effort for some groups of students. It's actually because this is good education and it's going to make things better for all. Our guidelines can support countries to meet their commitments to the UN CRPD. Almost every country in the world signed up, and those who haven't, the disagreements are not around inclusive education. It's something that countries, once they've signed, have a commitment to, so we need to support them. We feel that we do, and so that's what they're there for. And you can be part of this, and I think it's exciting. So I thank the people with disabilities who've contributed to my learning and who are certainly a part of the guidelines. And there's my email address if you're interested in talking further. And at that point, I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to hand back to my hosts to help me with whatever the questions are and how we deal with that.
Yes, Rhonda, thanks a lot. We are very pleased that you present to us whole guideline. We had a few comments during your presentation, and I answered because they were not directly, or maybe the answer on your question during the presentation when you asked.
Thank you, Dinka. Thank you.
To comment. Yeah. But we have now one comment. Maybe I think you could look our question and answer. We have a comment from the Nathaniel Rabin from France. If you look.
Yes. Yes, I see it. And so the point is, how do you convince?
Could we read, Rhonda? Just could you read? Maybe everybody can.
I will. Yes. So how do you convince headmasters and teachers that inclusive education is a good way for all the students? And yeah, isn't that is such a challenging one. And you know, what worries me, I suppose, is that people still need to be convinced. And one of the studies that I did, there was a school where the child had such a miserable time, the family had decided to move her for the final year of primary school. And you'd think, you know, if it weren't that bad, you'd sort of wait until you had the big transition into secondary school. But they moved because it was terrible. They moved just across the suburb to a very similar school in the same school system, so all the same policies, teachers came from the same sort of things, a whole lot of factors were all the same. The difference was the principal who really understood inclusion, and he had it as something that really was so important to him. He employed teachers that had the same view. He who understood inclusion. He made sure that the teacher assigned to that class really understood what the inclusive practice was about. And within 3 weeks, that child was noticeably different. Some of the resistant, avoidant behaviours that the previous school had found terribly problematic just didn't exist. Now, we know that school leaders really matter. One of the authors in the guidelines was a principal of set up a school in Indonesia to be an inclusive school. We know that leaders really matter, but to get to the heart of the question of how do you convince people, the evidence is there. So you can show people the guidelines and show them the evidence, but sometimes, as we know in many circumstances, it's not really the evidence that people reading it will think, oh, you are right after all. It's really sometimes about people just being, having a go and working with them. Sometimes though, it does mean like that family, if it's not working, move to another school. It's terribly sad. There are also other ways, I suppose, of going higher, going into the system levels, because countries that have signed and have legislation also then have policies, and those policies go down to school level. So you can get some movement around support from more the system level into those schools. At a personal level, I found that working closely with my daughter's teachers and trying to build a relationship with them, encouraging them when things were going well and problem solving when they weren't in a mutual way, gradually sometimes built the relationships. Sorry, Maria, I wish I had an easy solution. Oh, was that Maria? Maybe not.
Yeah, thank you, Rhonda. Now we have 2 questions in Ukrainian. I will try by Google say to you in English. Okay, first comments and question from Maria Skurchanska is, how does inclusive education affect children with normal development? Because the parents often worry the children with special education needs will interfere with their children's education. And this is a case in Ukraine. How can the positive impact of inclusive education be seen in the practice?
Yep, that's a really important one. It comes up all the time. And there is good research to show that those children without disabilities do better, or at least don't do worse. So it's either no effect or positive, which is a really important thing. And we know that good teaching is what inclusive education is about. Meeting the needs of learners is actually leading to good practice in the classroom. So students do better. That's an important point to know. Yes, there might be difficulties with behaviours initially, but after time, the children will learn from the others, learn how to copy, learn what behaviour is expected. And also, if we're attending to those sorts of difficulties, looking at the barriers, looking at what's causing those sorts of behaviours, then the other children won't be suffering. But it is an important point, and we can be confident that the research tells us that they will benefit.
Yeah, thank you. We have another question from Olga Smirnova. She asked, is it possible to get more information about working with a person with children with Down syndrome in the kindergartens?
Yes, I have a book on it actually, just out. But if that lady wants to email me, I can give some other information too. Yep.
Yeah, Olga, please send the mail to Rhonda.
Yes, and the guidelines also have some sections specifically about preschool, but there's more detail in not just flogging my book. It's there. We brought together the evidence from the different areas of schooling.
Okay, another comment is from Tanya Mikhailenko.
Mm-hmm.
You could see in English, it will be very helpful to show the education authorities to studies results you mentioned, where we can find them.
And in the guidelines at the back, we put an extensive reference list. So all of the research that's documented has a reference. And if anybody has difficulties accessing those references, contact Down Syndrome International or me. So if anybody on the call, you can just email me and I can help you locate those, but they're all there because that's exactly right. The people need to be confident that we've got evidence behind us.
Yeah, thank you very much. Tanya, if you would like to have some more, just go like Rhonda said. We have another comment or question. What to do if a child with Down syndrome does not want to study, although the teachers and assistants make every effort to make it comfortable for them to study? The children runs away from the lesson, does not respond to any encouragement.
Yeah. Oh, look, my daughter used to go around the house saying, I hate numbers. I hate the number 3. I hate the number 7. Bit sad for me as a maths teacher, but these things can be transitory. So that need not always be the case. And maybe the behavior is communicating something. So maybe the material is either too easy, and sometimes we make material too easy thinking that people, well, that'll get them into it, whereas actually maybe they need it to be more challenging. But we might also bring in ideas of peer pressure. So look at what the other children are doing. Let's do what they're doing, and maybe withdrawing the aid, keeping an eye on the child, but withdrawing the aid and focusing in on the learning of the others and praising the learning of the others. That might be more for a longer conversation. So email again would be most welcome.
Thank you, Rhonda. We have a very important situation in Sweden. Maybe we could read, maybe better. Your English is much better than mine.
My accent is not easy to follow, but anyway. So the issue in Sweden lies in the fact that if a parent chooses to have their child with Down syndrome in a segregated environment, the school receives more financial support from the government compared to when the child is integrated into a regular classroom following the ordinary curriculum. Consequently, if the child with DS is placed in the standard inclusive school setting, the school may lack the necessary resources to adequately support or accommodate the child. In light of this, would you still advocate for inclusion? Geez, that's a mean one that they're doing to people, isn't it? You know, it's sort of like, well, you can have that, but well, if you choose it, well, that's bad luck for you, isn't it? And I think also it does put parents in a really difficult position. One thing to remember, though, is that our learners with Down syndrome actually don't need a lot of expensive education support. It's not as though they need specialised motorised wheelchairs, or many don't need computer packages and augmentative and alternative communication devices. They don't need a whole lot of things that might be very expensive. Paying for somebody like a teaching assistant to work one-on-one with a student is very expensive, often offered, but actually not what research suggests is the best way to support a learner with Down syndrome. So kids may actually be better off without all that expensive support. And we certainly know they will be better off in that learning environment alongside age peers. But it is an unfortunate policy that has that. And we do know that the special education system is an expensive one. So, yeah, I can see that the challenge. So, but would I still advocate for inclusion? Yes, I would, because we know the research evidence is clear that when inclusion is done as true inclusion, learners do better.
Yeah, thanks, Rhonda, and thanks to Karen. I personally was some time in Sweden, living in Stockholm, and really I was very pleased when I saw a young person with motorical disabilities that taxi every morning pick up her, and she come to the office and work. And I said, oh my God, in Sweden, this is fantastic. Karen, I'm a little bit surprised with this, but I hope that you will find the possibilities to change this. If that is possible for the person with motorical disability, I guess that is possible for our children as well. I know it's not easy, but I hope that this guideline could help you. And also maybe through your association in Sweden and ETSA, we could try to change these things in Sweden. Maybe another case, sometimes is easier for the parents that child is all the time in the class in the desegregation environment because they have a lot of things. But another side, for children, it's much better to be integrated in the regular school. Like Rhonda said, we had a lot of evidence and much better results for the children. I could say that we have several books from the Sue Buckley and her team that show us these results. Why is it better that children with Down syndrome are in regular school? It's really easy that books, even there are on the internet, on Down Syndrome Education International, and I guess it's easier to find this information and try to continue work on this inclusion for your children in Sweden. Thank you very much for your question or comments, and also to Rhonda to answer. At the moment, okay, we have one more. Let me see that I answer that. Oh, no, sorry, translate. Okay, first is from Irina Gladchenko. I hope I said correct. Do institutions with inclusive form of education use programs of corrective and development direction? Which exactly? Maybe, Rhonda, this translation by Google is not so nice to understand.
I think I might have the sense of it. And I'm thinking it's about when you have children with disabilities or intellectual disabilities in the classroom, do they have a special program? And that isn't the usual way. The usual way is to make adjustments to the lesson. So as the teacher is preparing their lesson for all the students, they also thinking about what are the barriers, what help are students going to need. So it's the teacher thinking about how to make the lesson successful for the learners. There, of course, are people who want to sell programs, but because they are for just anybody, even though they might be writing them all for students with intellectual disability, they're not the child that's sitting in the class that teacher is working with. So that's not usually the approach that's taken.
Okay. Thank you. We have another question from Dariana Romanenko. What is the optimal number of the students in inclusion? What is the acceptable number of the students with special needs in the class?
Yeah, that's a really interesting one. And there've been some international studies around class sizes based on results in those international tests that countries do. Things like the PISA and the TIMSS test, Program of International something or other. But these where countries are compared with other countries, and there are some data around class sizes and the effects on education. It's not very easy to work it out because it's not a direct amount. But what we do know, or what we believe is important, is that we have roughly a proportion of people with disability in the general community would mirror what's in a classroom. So some schools do such a great job of their education of students with Down syndrome, for example, that parents far and wide, we know which schools are the good ones. And so we try to get our kids into those schools. So sometimes they can have more students than perhaps they should. And it can be quite difficult. I've also seen some schools where they try to help out by putting all the kids with disabilities into one class with a few other kids. And so that makes it a very difficult environment for a teacher. And I don't know that there's any research, certainly none that I'm aware of, that says what the actual best numbers are. But I think that principle of just what would mirror the population around would be a good one, just to think, well, where would these kids be if they didn't have a disability? And so that sort of ratio becomes then just a typical sort of ratio around in the school.
I could say, or add on this what Rhonda explained, we in Croatia has even in the, let's say, a law or advisement in some protocols that in the class could be maximum 3 persons with disabilities. Doesn't matter which one.
Right.
That means we could have a 3 child with Down syndrome. We could have a 1 with autism, 1 Down syndrome, 1 motorical, but maximum is a 3. And in that case, for maximum number of children, it's not like example 25 children in the class. It's like example 21 or 20 or 22 is dependent of this maximum number, how children it is. It's regulated on that way.
Yeah. And I think different countries have tried to work out different guidelines for their own systems. But as far as I know, I'm not aware of any research that gives us advice on what's best. That's good question, isn't it?
Yes, but I could add, we had a situation in Poland that we had in the class 5 children with Down syndrome and 1 assistant, because they had a lot of children with Down syndrome, and they tried to put into several classes But in that case, they agreed the 5 children and 1 assistant and other kids with without disabilities. It's dependent of the country to country.
It is.
So how many teaching assistant could allowed in the same class? That's my experience through this years with some of our countries. What we
and there's a bit of a sense that all kids with Down syndrome are the same. So if you put 5 together in the class, well, they can all be taught the same. But we all know that they're all different. So anyway.
Okay, another question, it is from Irina Gachenko. Have you researched the rate of educational attrition during distance education for children with Down syndrome?
That there's a big one through COVID, isn't it? Where we had children, well, schools closed around the world, billions of children out of school. And I do keep my eye on the research that is emerging out of that, but I don't know of any that's been done yet around the impact for students with Down syndrome. More generally, we know that there are many children who are experiencing difficulties returning to school. So kids without disabilities necessarily just finding it really difficult to go back to school. And I don't know that anybody has any solutions to it yet. And I don't think there would be any reason to think that it would be different for kids with Down syndrome. So we're likely to be seeing the same sort of experiences of children not wanting to go back to school or finding it very difficult to return to school. I think until we do get some better evidence behind us, the best we can do is just try to help. And I think it would also help for us to remember that learning is lifelong. And if it's not going to happen today, maybe it'll be next week, maybe it'll be in a year's time, but it will happen. And we can return kids to learn and engage with their school.
Rhonda, thanks a lot. At the moment, we don't have new questions, some comments. I would like that we are going to close this our webinar for today. We are looking forward for next webinar, I hope in 1 month. Oh, okay. This is a just comment from Karen. Thank you for a great, inspiring webinar. There is still much work to be done, both in Sweden and around the world. Good luck, everyone. Thank you, Karen. You said the best words for the end of this our webinar. Yes, it's a lot of work still, but I think that with very nice and good our scientific experts like Rhonda, like our Sue Buckley, and a lot of others who are so much involved in education and inclusion of our children with Down syndrome and our youngsters as well. I hope that we could have a better future for our children and our youngsters, and go towards the next step. That is after education, it's employment. That we have more and more young people who are employed on different version, a different combination of the work, and also to look forward to self-advocacy and also independent living. I know so many times this is just quite far from us, but it's possible. And I think that several countries could show us how that could be very, very near future. We had a very good experience from the Italian, from Spanish, we have from UK, we have France, from Germany, if I look just Europe. And for the education, we have even for some small countries, very good experience about inclusion. I could say that still we do not have inclusion. We have a, let's say, integration, but we are looking forward to go towards inclusion, and it's a lot of work. And please, all who are today with us, help us, work with us in your countries, with other experts, with your association, because when we are united, we could do a lot of things. Thank you to all of you. I guess this is all thanks what came in different language. And really see soon in 1 month. And also we would like to inform you that next week on Saturday, we will have on our ETSA Facebook site, we will have a seminar about self-advocacy. Please follow us on Facebook, and you will be able to listen in English. I'm sorry, it will not be translation to another language, but it will be very nice topics about self-advocacy, very nice everyday life and work of the person who are on that way in different countries. Thank you very much. Have a nice evening and be in touch. Bye-bye.